Howdy readers, I'm Jason. This is Chapter and Verse, and this is a tag video. This is a tag that has been making the rounds. I have gotten away from making tag videos, which I'm not happy about. Tag videos are probably my favorite kind of videos to make. But between this project and that project and all the other things just taking up my time, I have not made a tag video in a while now. And I certainly haven't made a tag video that was kind of trending, one might say. And this is trending right now. And I have been really wanting to do it. So this tag had a really interesting genesis. It started with a video that Alex from What Page Are You On put up about his favorite writers. And he had essentially 3 tiers. Okay, there were not quites, there were maybes, and then his favorite writers. It was a great video. I watched it on my lunch break. And then later that day, I saw that Steve, I think it was later that day, I saw that Steve had put up a video called the My Favorite Writers tag. And as soon as I saw the title of that video, I had a sneaky suspicion that Steve had seen Alex's video and decided this would make a great tag. And I was right. That's exactly what Steve did. So it is now officially a tag. And it works like this. So like I said, you've got 3 categories, 3 tiers, okay? You're not quite authors, which is your 3rd tier, and you name 6 of those in no particular order. And your 2nd tier are your maybes, okay? You choose 4 of these in no particular order, just like your not quites. And I define the maybes as writers who might, on any given day, depending on your mood, depending on what you're reading, these are writers who might tag team their way in to your favorites and essentially swap places with your favorites. And then your top tier, of course, are your favorite writers. You choose 5 of these, and you're supposed to rank them. So, trying to decide how I define my favorite writers, how I settle on them, was tricky, and I'm not probably going to spend a lot of time elaborating on that process. I kind of look at this tag as the writer's version of the BookTube Top 10s tag that I created once upon a time, where people made videos about their 10 favorite books. So here we're looking at the writers who are most important to you. 5 favorites, 4 maybes, and 6 not quites. So let's do this, shall we? I'm going to start, per what everybody else has been doing, with the not quites, okay? Writers who aren't necessarily my favorites, or aren't even kind of swapping their way or cycling their way into my favorites, but who are my dependable and sometimes exhilarating supporting cast of writers that I really dearly love. So let me scoot these books away from the tripod there so we don't get any shake and wiggle. So the first writer that I'm going to talk about in my not quites is Virginia Woolf, and this is her very slim, wonderful, fierce, and ferocious book, A Room of One's Own. And I read this, donkeys years ago. Virginia Woolf is a writer that I've only read 2 books by, this and To the Lighthouse. And basically, she didn't kind of creep her way into the maybes because I've only just read these 2. And I suspect that when I read more of her work, it's going to impress me more still. And I mean, like I said, I absolutely love this book. To the Lighthouse was a book that I really admired all the way through it. And then the final pages into The Lighthouse, like, blew my mind, right? Like, I mean, absolutely blew my mind. And I suspect when I finally get around to reading The Years and The Waves and Orlando and Mrs. Dalloway, that Virginia Woolf is going to climb her way out of the not quites. But yeah, I absolutely love her work. My next not quite author is Willa Cather. And from Willa Cather, I have read The Song of the Lark, O Pioneers, and My Antonia. I really love that cover of My Antonia. Of these books, My Antonia is my favorite. She almost made it into the maybes, and the reason she didn't is because I feel like I really need to reread O Pioneers. So way back when I read that book, I was disappointed in the ending. It made no sense to me. It infuriated me. I felt like it was, I don't know. I felt like it was kind of pie in the sky. I felt like it was cop-out. And then years later, I heard a sermon. And that sermon made me think of the ending of O Pioneers. And it made me think I had got the ending of that book wrong. And were I to reread it, and were that ending to conform to what I now suspect Cather was going for with it, she might very well climb her way into the maybes without even reading any of her other work, just on the strength of a reread of O Pioneers. My next writer in my not quite category is Philip Roth. And this is his Pulitzer Prize winning novel, American Pastoral, which is my favorite book of his. I've read, 5 or 6 books of his. I'm reading one of his right now. And this book, to my mind, is a novel that is going to be around for as long as America is around, and as long as novels are being read and studied and appreciated in America. My friend Leonard and I are doing a buddy read right now of Roth's I Married a Communist, and we have just been marveling at how little Roth is appreciated by some people here on BookTube, and it just really boggles the mind. When you read a Philip Roth book, almost from the very beginning, down to the level of sentences, you realize that you're in really, really good hands. That he is a writer whose intellect is such, and whose sense of his craft, I suppose, is such that he's not going to kind of set you adrift, right? He's going to bring you into port. Some of the books are going to be more successful than others, but when he's on, like he is here, he is absolutely on. So he is another writer who may very well climb up into the favorites the more of his work that I read, because I still haven't read Sabbath Theater, or The Plot Against America, or The Human Stain, or Operation Shylock, or The Counterlife. And once I read those books, who knows how I'll feel about Roth. But I'm suspecting I'll have an even higher opinion of him than I do now. And next up, in the not quite, controversially perhaps, especially given that we are in the middle of ShakeTube, which is an event that I'm co-hosting, is William Shakespeare. And William Shakespeare is here rather than in the maybes and the favorites, simply because there are plays of his that I just don't really like very much. Cymbeline, for instance, although I feel like I really need to reread Cymbeline. But also Troilus and Cressida, Antony and Cleopatra. I just don't really care for them very much. I mean, they're fine, they're all right, they're good plays, they're good enough. But when Shakespeare is firing on all cylinders, like he is in The Tempest, which is my favorite Shakespeare play, like he is in The Winter's Tale, like he is in Hamlet, he really can't be beaten. But the problem is that he was so prolific, there are going to be troughs as well as peaks. And I just couldn't put him any higher than the not quites, although it feels like blasphemy to me. It feels like a sin somehow. But yeah, so William Shakespeare. And then next in my not quites is a mystery writer named Henning Mankell. And Henning Mankell is a writer whose work I have read the most of. I think I have read a dozen of his books, including all 10 of the kind of official Wallander novels. These are my two favorite of the Wallander novels. The Man Who Smiled is by far my most favorite, and then One Step Behind. And he really didn't kind of climb out of that, because as much as I love that character and as much as I love those books, there just isn't the richness of language that there is in most of the other writers that we're going to be talking about here. But I do love Henning Mankell. And then the last writer in my not quites is a nonfiction writer, my first strictly nonfiction writer in these categories, in these tiers, and that is Lauren F. Winner. And she is a Christian writer. She is a professor at Duke University. This is her memoir, Girl Meets God, which is probably my favorite memoir from anyone. And this is essentially a kind of sequel memoir that she wrote called Still, Notes on a Mid-Faith Crisis. If you can see this kind of jumble of letters there, which look to be forming a kind of mirror on the wall. But anyway, if you haven't read Lauren Winner, you should, especially if you have a reasonably simple view of Christian faith, and a reasonably unflattering view of Christian faith, because Lauren Winner is a freaking genius. I'm not using that word lightly at all. By the time she was in her, I don't know, let's say mid-30s or something, I think she had her divinity degree. She had 2 master's degrees. I think she had a PhD. She had published a half dozen books. And this was all, again, by the time she was like 34 or something, 35. And she is absolutely fabulous. Now, in the maybe category, so the 4 writers I've chosen who could, again, sort of swap their way into my favorites list on any given day. The first of these is Peter Matheson, and these are the 2 books of his that I've read. At Play in the Fields of the Lord, which is a novel of his, and was a finalist for the National Book Award, and The Snow Leopard, which is nonfiction, which won the National Book Award, and which may be the best nonfiction that I've ever read. I've still only read it once. This was, I mean, when I was an undergraduate, it was forever ago, but it lives so large in my memory, and part of me is afraid that if I were to reread it, that it wouldn't hold up or wouldn't live up to my memory of it, which feels absurd to me to consider, because this is a modern classic. It was just chosen in the last couple of years for inclusion in the Folio Society, so there's a beautiful Folio Society edition of this book, and I hope to own it one day. If ever there was a champion for the earth, right? With all the talk about climate change and what we're doing to the planet and what may or may not be irreversible, Peter Matheson, more than any writer I've ever read, was an absolute, unconditional, and poetic champion of the planet and the animal species on it, and he was a writer who really looked to, I think, hold human beings accountable for their treatment of the planet and for their treatment of other species. So that's Peter Matheson. My next maybe is my friend Sarah Waters. This is my favorite novel of hers, Tipping the Velvet. And again, when she is on, like she is in this book, like she is in her novel The Night Watch, like she is in Fingersmith, there's really, there's really nobody better. I mean, she is as good as anybody writing fiction today, when she's doing it as well as she's capable of. I feel like sometimes she missteps just a tiny bit. I didn't really like the ending of The Paying Guests. And I've read The Little Stranger a couple of times, and I have some issues with that novel as well. But Sarah Waters is absolutely magnificent. If you love really lush historical fiction with brilliant, deep, mischievous characterization, then you need to read the novels of Sarah Waters. My next maybe is Hilary Mantel. Right, this is Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, the first 2 novels in her Thomas Cromwell trilogy. The third one, The Mirror and the Light, is set to be published this coming March. I'm going to be doing a read-along of the 3 books. We're going to read Wolf Hall in January, Bring Up the Bodies in February, and The Mirror and the Light for March of the Mammoths. If that third book is anything even remotely as good as Wolf Hall, it is going to guarantee her place forever in the canon. Only 3 writers have won the Booker Prize twice: J.M. Coetzee, Peter Carey, and Hilary Mantel. And my hunch is that The Mirror and the Light is going to be the book to beat for the Booker Prize next year, which would make her the only writer who has won it 3 times. So fingers crossed. And then the last writer that I wanted to include in my maybes is a poet. He is the only poet on this list. Shakespeare's a poet as well, obviously, but he's primarily known as a playwright. And that is Christian Wyman. And this is his collection of poetry, Every Written Thing, which I just revere. I absolutely adore this book. It's a perfect collection of poetry. And then this is his memoir, My Bright Abyss, Meditation of a Modern Believer. And if you are at all interested in, I've seen in numerous BookTube videos where people, in talking about the work of Marilynne Robinson or talking about the work of Jamie Quattrow, people have essentially talked about how they never really could understand how somebody could be a Christian, could be a person of faith as an adult. And that, book X or book Y, maybe Gilead, maybe Fire Sermon, help them understand that really for the first time. If you're one of those people who feels like religion was relegated to, and should be relegated to, youth, to childhood, to how you saw the world then, and that it really has no place or can have no place in your adult life, read Christian Wyman's memoir. Not to be converted, but so that you can see, so you can have some better sense of how a mind like his, a diamond sharp intellect like his, can have as well a life of faith. That it is not something that should be relegated to playthings from our childhoods. And then finally we come to my favorites. And the favorites, right, you name 5 of them, and these you're supposed to rank for the purposes of this tag. So I'm going to start with number 5. And number 5, much to the chagrin, I'm sure, of some other booktubers out there, is going to be Cormac McCarthy. And here is my favorite of his books, The Road. I do indeed stand by The Road. McCarthy, like Brian from Bookish has said in his video, in his version of this tag, McCarthy's not for everybody. But McCarthy's vision of the world, his vision of humanity, what it's capable of, and I'm not just talking about the violence and the depravity and the brutality, but the moments of hope as well, the moments of conscience. God, he is just a firebrand, really. And when he is writing in a kind of fever, as he does in most of Blood Meridian, for instance. Blood Meridian has like a 2.5-page passage that is the best chunk of prose I've ever read. He just can't be touched. I feel like he is probably one of 2 of America's greatest living novelists. The other of those novelists is my number 4 choice here in my favorites list, and that is Marilynne Robinson. This is her novel Gilead, which won the Pulitzer Prize. It is the first in a trilogy of novels, the second of which I read, Home, the third of which, Lila, I'm going to be reading this December, I think. And then this is her book of essays that I just dearly love as well, The Death of Adam, Essays on Modern Thought. And Marilynne Robinson is one of these writers who, so I read an article once, I think maybe it was an interview actually, where somebody said that if you find yourself invited to a dinner party and you go and you discover that you're seated next to Marilynne Robinson, you don't talk because you're just worried, not about how she's going to look at you or treat you. I don't get the sense at all that she's that kind of person. But her mind is such, and her conversation is such, and just the way she thinks and she sees and she intuits, it's just astonishing. She is an astonishing writer, but more importantly, she seems to me to be an astonishing soul. and an astonishing intellect. And yeah, I hope she lives for another 40 years. I hope she breaks the world record for long life. And I hope she's lucid that whole time, and I hope she just continues writing, because the world is a better place for having her books in it. My number 3 favorite writer is Tim Winton, and this is the Folio Society edition of my favorite of his books, which is Cloud Street. Tim Winton has such a sense of place. He is from the area of Perth in Australia. I don't know if he was born there. He's been kind of cagey in interviews specifically about where he's from and where he lives now, for good reason. But he just has such a strong sense of environment, of community, of dialect, and his books, to my mind, are just wondrous, really. He almost edged his way into the number 2 slot on this list. That number 2 slot was taken by his countryman, Peter Carey. And this, to my mind, is Peter Carey's best novel. I haven't read all of his books, but I've read a hell of a lot of them. And I have read this one, Oscar and Lucinda, 7 times. I wrote my master's thesis on this book. It is a masterpiece. But my favorite of his, and I make this distinction between best and favorite after having had a conversation in the comments field on the channel of a new booktuber named Michelle Lexie, who is Australian, and who I think, if I remember right, she said in that conversation that she was from nearby where Tim Winton is from. But she asked me about what Peter Carey I would recommend. Initially, I told her that Oscar and Lucinda was the best. And then it occurred to me that I loved The Unusual Life of Tristan Smith even more. So while I think Oscar and Lucinda is his best work, this one is my favorite. And I think I've read this 3 times. If you haven't read him, please do. I'm probably going to do a read-along next year of one of his books. I'm not sure which one, and I'm not sure at what point during the year, but everybody needs to read more Peter Carey, whether they know it or not. And then my number 1 favorite writer, and this I'm sure comes as absolutely no surprise to anyone who has been following my channel for any stretch of time at all, is Charles Dickens. This is his novel Bleak House. This is the book that I put at number 1 on my version of my own BookTube Top 10s tag. It's, what is it, like 1,000 pages long, something like that. I think this is a perfect book. I think Great Expectations is a perfect book. I think A Christmas Carol is a perfect book. I think David Copperfield might be a perfect book. I even think that Our Mutual Friend might be a perfect book. A Tale of Two Cities is not a perfect book, but I mean, I just fucking devoured A Tale of Two Cities when I read it. I read Dickens about 12 pages an hour, and when I read A Tale of Two Cities, I read the last 100 pages of that book in one sitting. I couldn't move. I couldn't get up out of my chair. I was so gripped the last third or quarter of A Tale of Two Cities. Dickens is knocked by many. There are a lot of booktubers who really don't like him at all. He was paid by the word, and a lot of people feel like that leads to a prose style that is more digressive than it needs to be, is probably a polite way of saying that. So the thing about Dickens is that you're either on his wavelength or you're not, I think is really what it boils down to. And if you're not, that's fine. I mean, there are magnificent writers whose work I just don't get. Like, I'm just not on that wavelength. I have trouble with Faulkner. And Faulkner is Brian at Bookish, right? Again, one of my favorite booktubers. Faulkner was his number 1 writer in this tag, and I just have never been able to do it. I just can't do Faulkner's novels. I just can't. I hope that changes, but and I think the same thing holds true of Dickens. I think that you either fall all over yourself for what he is doing in his prose, in his stories, with his magnificent menagerie of characters. Nobody was better at creating characters than Charles Dickens, or you're not on that wavelength. And I just thank God that I am. So David Copperfield is the book that, if I live a ripe old age and I'm in hospice or something at the end of my life, David Copperfield is the book that I hope to be reading on my deathbed, basically. So I suppose that's high praise. It's morbid praise, but it's high praise all the same. Before I let you guys go and before I tag anybody, I thought you guys would be curious to know that of the 6 not quite writers in this tag video of mine, Henning Mankell, Virginia Woolf, Willa Cather, Lauren Winner, Philip Roth, and William Shakespeare, I have read 44 of their works, and Kelly and I own 54 of their works. Of the maybe category, the 4 writers who are Hilary Mantel, Christian Wyman, Peter Matheson, and Sarah Waters, I have read 13 of their works, and we own 21. And then of my 5 favorites, Charles Dickens, Peter Carey, Tim Winton, Marilyn Robinson, and Cormac McCarthy, I have read 27 of their books, and we own 53 of their books. I really like numbers, I like data, and so I hope some of you find that as interesting as I did. And now for tagging, I would like my wife, Kelly, from Books I'm Not Reading, to do this tag. Jasmine, the wonderfully newly engaged Jasmine from Jasmine's Reads, I'd like her to do this tag. Robert at Barter Hordes, I would like you to do this tag. Jay Shea, Amy Poole, and Juan from Just One Reader. I would love to find out what writers are your top tier, second tier, and third tier. I will put links in the description box below to Alex's video and to Steve's weaponizing of the video into a tag, to borrow Lukash's phrasing from Totally Pretentious. I hope to see more versions of this tag going around because I, for one, am just deeply fascinated by who those writers are that when the chips are down, we will always go to bat for, at least in this point in our lives. Who are the writers who make the biggest ripples in us? Who are the writers whose work rings loudest in us? I would love to know. So thank you for watching. I'm sorry this was so damn long, and I hope to see all of you again this weekend when I put up my video on The Winter's Tale by Shakespeare. So, adios.